Welcome to Level Up Tribes. Level Up Tribes provides resources to help you attain the necessary resources to level up your mind, body, and soul and realize your full potential. It is about exploring, learning, providing you with the tools from the experts for you to create a better version of yourself. I am your host, Agnes Goodwine, and welcome, Tribes.
Hi, how are you?
Good, and you?
I'm good. Well, it's nice to meet you. Have you attended M2 workshops through the city of Mesa?
Well, I've attended the meditation practices.
Okay.
Yeah, the 15 minutes.
Okay. Oh, in the studio.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
that's how I found you. It was actually in 2020 when like the beginning of 2020 and I saw the van outside and I was so excited because I had just started my yoga teacher training in January. And so I walk outside and I see this mindfulness truck and I'm like, oh.
My gateway to mindfulness was through yoga also.
Awesome. And so I
Yeah.
needed that day, I needed it so bad. And so I was so, I even posted, I looked today this morning, I said, I think I posted on Instagram about that day.
Okay.
And I did. Yeah, it was February 2020.
Oh my gosh, which was probably the last time we were out at Mesa
Yeah.
in the studio. We've actually continued to work with them very regularly, but now virtually.
I've seen the virtual ones. I like the van. It's very
You and me both, my friend. Yes.
I do. I like that, person
Yes,
concept.
I do too. I mean, you know, this is like kind of a whole area to unpack, but I really resisted virtual prior to COVID, mostly because I absolutely saw the value in it because I recognize that that's how some people feel comfortable interacting, and it can be super useful. And
Yeah.
I use interactive tools in my own practice. But I felt like, great, there's lots of that out there already. And where I felt like there was a gap was really how do we bring people like that within the same community together and help them identify, hey, there's all these people around me that are interested in this too, right? And I find that so much easier and more engaging to do in person than virtually.
Yeah. I
So,
agree.
yeah. Anyways, but here we are virtually.
Right.
So it all has its moment and utility for sure.
Now, well, when I started my podcast late 2019, my vision for my podcast was more like a traveling podcast in Arizona. And I would go to the businesses and interview entrepreneurs and, finding out how they started their business. And so the pandemic hit, and so I had to pivot to Zoom. And to be honest with you, it actually worked out perfectly because I have interviewed people from all over the world and made some personal connections that I would not have had the chance to otherwise.
I mean, 100%. And I think that there are people who engage with M2 virtual services who would not have come into the studio for a variety of reasons. Everything from convenience. I mean, as much as I believe, or the intention is to make it incredibly accessible and convenient by taking it on site, there still is a gap, right, between your desk and the studio. But even more than that, I think that the sort of anonymity and the like literal screen between the provider and the recipient sometimes helps people feel more comfortable. And the fact they can turn off their cameras, there's just, more opportunity for anonymity. So, I mean, it is the best of both worlds to be able to engage in person and virtually. And I think, even for myself, depending on the situation, or like what you're describing, sometimes I want to engage in person and sometimes this is great.
Yeah.
This makes it much more doable and yes, just lower stress and whatever. So
Yeah, I love it. And at least your background, it feels like I am in the studio
in the
because
studio.
I've been there, so I know what it looks like. I love it. Well, officially, thank you for being at Level of Trust podcast. I'm super excited. The topic of mindfulness is something that I cherish and I love it. I love learning more about it.
Mhm.
So today I have Susan West. She is the owner and general manager of M2 Wellbeing, Arizona's only mobile mindfulness studio and one of the nation's first. M2's mission is to meet communities where they are and provide resources, tools, and inspiration to improve mental health and well-being. Susan leverages her 30-year business career to make mindfulness practice more accessible and relevant to busy professionals. Her experience includes brand manager at Procter and Gamble, director at Parchment, assistant dean in Arizona State University, Go Devils, and business owner. Thank you again so much for being here.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm honored.
Yes, I'm so excited. I knew you were going to be on my podcast. It took 2 years, but it happened. I
Well,
visualized.
well, that actually warms my heart. That's so sweet.
So I know that you practice yoga, and from a little bit of research that I did, was that started in 2006. And then you loved the way it felt when you did our final practice, which is Shavasana, and that lovely 4 to 5 minute meditation practice. And then moving forward, I think you had mentioned in a prior podcast that you had a severe injury and some other personal crisis that happened back in 2014, which kind of shifted everything you've learned from yoga, from your professional careers, from your business mindset, and that shifted to now what you have today. Am I wrong by saying that?
No, I think you know more about me than my husband does. It's like,
Am I turning red?
yes, no, that is exactly right. I've always been really interested in health and wellness generally, but I think that most of my like 20s, 30s, and even starting into my 40s, I was really more focused on nutrition and movement and physical fitness, I guess. And when I started to practice yoga when I was pregnant with my son for the first time, and I had really bad sciatica even in my first trimester, like before I was even showing. And but I went to prenatal yoga. That's what prompted me to do that. And I would lie in shavasana at the end, and often I would cry, or I would really just be overcome with some kind of emotion that I wasn't even aware I was feeling. And that experience was so impactful to me. I just thought, wow, what is that? Where is it coming from? Why is it here? But I honestly didn't really follow up with that or pay that much attention to it, but it certainly caught my attention. And it really drew me into yoga because I thought, even though so much of the language was unfamiliar, even the word practice, like you just talked about a yoga practice, and we use the same verbiage and with mindfulness and meditation practice. And even though it's something that I can define as saying the reason we call it a practice is because we're always learning. It's always part of the journey. But those were like just words to me. I didn't really like totally embody or understand what that was. And it's just been over time really adhering to those practices, both of yoga, because that's still very much in my life, and mindfulness and meditation, that I really come to appreciate what that means for me. And so sometimes, like you referenced, like I loved Shavasana. Sometimes I kind of hated it because it was uncomfortable to feel really overwhelmed or feel this emotion or start crying in public. I was going to a yoga studio. I wasn't practicing on my own. It was prenatal yoga. So there was like, an additional dispensation for emotionality there. But even then it was, it surprised me. So it wasn't necessarily comfortable or desirable, but it was meaningful. And it was something that I just set aside. And then you followed that up saying 10 years later, almost in 2014, I had a herniated disc, which, for some people is nothing. And for other people, as was the case with me, it was a totally debilitating experience where I quit my job. I had small children I couldn't care for. And I was totally incapacitated. And, also just that was an experience where I had a lot of discomfort and pain and things I wanted to move away from. But I also had these other experiences of gratitude and just such appreciation for some of the more meaningful or important things in my life, like access to medicine and my family and their support, and just the education to understand what was happening, like lots of different things. But again, in a way that was like an embodied experience. It wasn't just sort of this intellectual, like I'd always been a person that could like sit down and write out gratitudes or something. Like I'm aware that I've had a lot of privilege and access and ease in my life, but that's like an intellectual exercise a lot of the time. And this was really a time where it just was part of who I was and what I was experiencing. And so when I healed physically from that process, and then just sort of returned to all my old kind of habits and approaches, I thought, okay, I actually kind of want to get back to this other thing, or just understand it more. And I got introduced to mindfulness. Again, this is like more of an intellectual exercise after having the experience of understanding like what it was for me in that moment, that sort of that pause, that sort of simplicity, that spaciousness. And then that really set me off on a different journey, because I thought, oh, this, all along I've been interested in well-being, but I don't think I fully understood or appreciated the mental health component of well-being. And then I thought, okay, this is amazing. And it's accessible and it's available and nobody's doing it. So at the time I actually took a course called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction in 2016. And at that time, the statistics that were available basically were, and I can talk more about the course if you want to hear it, but the statistics that were available in the United States was that fewer than 8% of adults had meditated even one time in the last 12 months. So I'm just thinking, okay, here's this thing that's free, available. You don't need any equipment or physical ability or, special ability or money or anything.
Yeah.
And there's volumes of academic and scientific data to support how impactful and positive it can be for your mental health. And yet fewer than 8% of people did it even once. So I thought, okay, I got to do something with this, like this. There's some big message that's missing out here. And how do we get the message out there, make it engaging, invite people in, help them adhere, all this stuff. So I think I just went down like 4 different rabbit holes, but
No, I hear the excitement because I'm like baby step number 1 compared to where you are as a teacher. But when you learn this, when I was going through my training in 2020 and I was learning it, I'm like, and it helped me so much with my own like trauma and anxiety. I'm like, why people are not doing this? And so you want to share, everything that you're learning with the world. And so I totally understand where you're coming from from that standpoint. But I wanted you to kind of speak on the course.
So MBSR stands for Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction. It is a protocol that was created by Jon Kabat-Zinn, who some people call or attribute a lot of the modern mindfulness movement and its acceptance in the United States in particular, but in Western society, is attributable to some of the work that he did. I think it was in the 1980s, actually. And I think, my gosh, I want to say he's a scientist. He's a PhD. I want to say it's some bio something or other, but I might misspeak, so I don't want to do that, at the University of Massachusetts. But my understanding is that as a young man, when he was studying, he spent some time in India and studying some of these old contemplative practices, and became just personally adopted meditation. And there was some people, some of his colleagues or contemporaries, Sharon Salzberg and Joseph Goldstein. Again, this is just stuff I've read about, so I don't want to definitively state this stuff, but this is my understanding. It's kind of a series of people who were in India and developing this interest at the same time, and came back to the US, and they all went in different, or some of them went in different directions, but they were part of creating some programming that made it accessible. Now, John Kabat-Zinn specifically was at University of Massachusetts, and I believe he was working with patients who experienced or lived with chronic pain. And because of his personal meditation practice, he thought there was some potential to use meditation as like in a clinical setting to treat pain management. And so he created this. I mean, again, I don't exactly know how he created it, but the outcome was a course called Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction. It's an 8-week course, and it's very structured. There's a series of topics that you cover every week. Included in that 8-week, typically, I think at least when I took it, I want to say we met in person for 2.5 hours each week, just one day a week. And then the assignments were daily meditations that ranged in duration from like 30 to 45 minutes. So it was pretty heavy time commitment. But that particular course was like the first one that was measured, and hugely positive impact on the way people experienced pain. And so, and the reason, some of the reasons for that is just by developing some distance between stimulus and response, and, enables people to kind of lower their resistance, their fear, some of the emotions around pain, and it helps them experience less of it. So their medical conditions didn't change at all, but the way they were experiencing pain literally had statistically significant outcomes and improvement. And so this was like the first time that there was like this, or, sort of one of the big, big first cases. There wasn't a lot of research on mindfulness at this time where there was a discrete benefit to this practice. And what he did take some care, because he was a scientist, to remove some of the more like religious references in the practice, and really just kind of distill it down to more of the like contemplative component. Anyways, that really set the stage to validate the approach and help, make it not just accessible, but like not exclusive, right? By removing the religious piece of it. Although some people, less so now, but initially I think there was some resistance to it, feeling like that was actually just some kind of undercover way of introducing different religions. But anyways, so that, and that same protocol, I mean, I'm sure it's evolved a little bit over time, but has persisted. It was such a solid approach, and they've ended up finding that not only did it work for pain management, but it worked for stress management and emotional regulation and experiencing fewer negative emotions, which then helped build relationships. I mean, the benefits sort of went on. And then you saw this huge explosion of scientific inquiry around these approaches or these contemplative practices, and how they could be used in secular settings, right? And make them more accessible. So he was sort of like the progenitor, I guess, of the modern movement, or one of them, I should say. And that's the course that I took. And I found it really impactful, again, for me personally. Sort of brought together all these little pieces that I had experienced, like the Shavasana and yoga, or the gratitude when I was really ill, and kind of gave it like, oh, this isn't just accidental. Like, this can be cultivated, and this can be intentional. And so what happened is that I took this course, and like I said, it's rigorous and it's time consuming. And then on day, whatever it is, 8 weeks and 7 days, whatever, it ends and it's over.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, sister, right. Like, you got this. You're totally intrinsically motivated forevermore. Sayonara. And that was the piece that I was like, okay, hold on one second. Because I thought, yeah, this is impactful, but now I just need some support to kind of keep it in my life. And in parallel, when I took this course, I actually took it from a friend she was a trained mindfulness instructor. And I took it with kind of my local BFF. And so for us to go on that journey together and think this is something we want to keep in our lives, like I had a little bit of a built-in support system.
Okay.
To try to maintain it. And even then it was difficult, but I thought, well, so that was the piece that I wanted to work on. I thought this is just like too much of a cliff to go off. But the piece of it that was also relevant to me, so in 2016, my kids were, I have to do some math, please hold, like 9 and 7 or something, like whatever it was. They're still pretty young. And so especially at that time, I'm working, I have youngish children, and I just thought, I actually don't want another place to go. Like, I don't want to go to my yoga studio and my meditation studio and this and that and the other. What I want is like my fellow mommies and my friends to be getting interested in the same stuff. So that when we're sitting around, like, having wine or whatever, that's what we're talking about. And so to me, it was like, how do we not only introduce these techniques to people, but how do you like build it into their lives? Because even now, like, this is my job and it's still a challenge to build it and keep it in my life. You know what I mean? Like many of us, I shouldn't say we all, but many of us feel like, oh, I just cannot do one more thing. I'm sure it's really good for me. I'm sure I would love it, blah, blah, blah. But I do not even have a 5-minute segment of my day that I can allocate to this or whatever. So anyway, so it's all just part of how do you kind of work with people to build it into their life from the ground up, wherever they are and with whom they are. So.
Yeah. So after you took the course, you just said that you wanted more, you wanted to share the practice. When did the idea surface for you to have the M2 Wellness mobile? Like, I'm always curious about that moment where you're like,
yeah, it was very specific, actually. It was totally like a moment of inspiration. And that was, so like, as I was describing to it, I kind of had a whiteboard. It was a Google Doc, but that was my whiteboard. And I just had these thoughts swirling around, like whatever, awareness, engagement, but it was all around community. Like, to me, the community piece was very important. And so I just almost like had that literally present in front of my face all the time. And one afternoon, I was going to get my hair cut, and I was driving to the hairdresser. I was driving down Scottsdale Road. None of this is that important, but it's just like, it just with a clear memory. And literally, I'm traveling south, and traveling north comes a drip room truck. I don't know if you're familiar with the drip room. I actually wasn't that familiar with the drip room, to be honest. I didn't even really understand what it was. But what I did understand seeing this thing was like, oh, it's like a food truck, but instead of food, it's some kind of
the IV drip.
Yeah, it's like some kind of like health or well-being service. And literally in that moment, I was like, oh my God, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put a meditation studio in a vehicle. And I'm going to take that out and find communities wherever they are. And that's how I'm going to approach this. So it was literally like, I got my hair cut. I like ran home. And when I got home, I Googled mobile mindfulness studio or mobile meditation studio, probably both. And in fact, one popped up, and it was in Detroit.
Oh, wow. Out of all places.
Yeah. And so I clicked on their website and I looked at it. And I was like, yes, this is exactly what I am talking about.
I love it.
And I thought, well, Detroit, that's like however many thousands of miles away. I can do this here. And and so that was where I got sort of the idea sort of came to me spontaneously, and then kind of got affirmed both at like, oh, okay, I can see what this might look like, and it's not prevalent. You
Yeah.
know, I think there's an opportunity, a market opportunity here. And so I was like, okay, this is what I want to do. Now, from that moment to the day that I actually bought the vehicle
Mm.
there was almost a year to the day between the
Oh,
idea and buying the vehicle. And that was because mostly I was getting up the nerve and, um, sort of trying to gather courage to invest in this business. At the time, I worked with an artist to create some renderings, which it's funny because if you see the renderings now, they look nothing how it turned out, but that's okay. It was just a way to bring it to life for people. And I started just cold calling some businesses in town and saying, if I had this service, would you buy it?
yeah.
It was, I mean, it was pretty unsophisticated. But, it helped me get out there and start talking to people. I felt like the idea was warmly received. And I first said to myself, if one person says, okay, I'm in, I'm going to give you a contract, I'm buying a vehicle. As it turns out, I did not get that contract and nobody bought beforehand. And I was talking to a different friend. And this friend, actually, she's an advisor for startups, particularly for women. And she helped me go through what's the investment and what's the potential for loss. How much if you invested in this, you could still sell some of the assets and get some money back. So really what is your out of pocket risk? We arrived at a number and it was $30,000. And she said, she just looked at me and said, there are almost no businesses you can start for $30,000. So if you don't feel comfortable risking $30,000, then you're probably not comfortable starting your own business.
Mm.
And that was, I guess, her opinion, but it was also that was my second aha moment, which is I had dabbled previously in starting my own businesses, but what I was always putting at risk was my time or my opportunity cost of income to some extent. And, you read I follow lots of podcasts or blogs or whatever about entrepreneurs and people raising money and bajillions of dollars and stuff like that. And I realized that I needed to gather the courage and the confidence to say that I'm capable. I am worthy of this financial risk, and I mean, and understanding it is a risk, there's no guarantee, but, and so that was the other piece that was really critical to starting this business, was really thinking, do I think I can do this? And if I do, then I have to put my money where my mouth is, I guess.
Were you working at Procter and Gamble at that time when all this was going on?
No. So when I worked for Procter and Gamble in the 90s. That was my first job my first big career job out of school. But I worked at ASU, Arizona State, for a number of years when I first moved to Arizona, which was now actually 17 years ago. But I was there, and then when then I was at Parchment, and then when I had my back injury, when I started working again, I was actually consulting, and I had a couple retained clients and stuff. So
So you've always had an entrepreneurial mindset, it sounds like, or
yes, well, I've certainly always had the desire.
oh,
And even when I went to business school, but I remember writing the essays. And it's funny, even thinking back, what's your goal? And my goal was always, I actually said general manager, because when I applied to business school, I was applying from Procter and Gamble, so that was just sort of more the structure that was more immediate, or a bit that I related to at the time. but the point of that story is that like, I've always been a bit of a generalist and everything interests me a little bit. So what appeals to me about being a business owner is, I mean, I'm literally like learning about a generator and changing the oil and cleaning stuff and then doing my bookkeeping and then creating marketing materials and going out and selling stuff. It's just, and I enjoy that.
Okay.
I mean, I certainly don't enjoy all those things actually, but overall, I find that stimulating and interesting. And so I always had more of like the entrepreneurship thing because I never had a desire to be highly specialized.
I love it. So who was your first contract? I'm curious to ask.
My first actual contract was with Mobile Mini. I think they have a new name now. I'm not sure, but actually that opportunity came to me through Cigna, the health insurance company. And somebody I had worked with in the past was at Cigna, and she was one of the people that I reached out to when I was doing this ideating and just trying to get a feel for whether I had a viable business idea. And she was enthusiastic. And so when I created the studio and I was ready to really go out and sell, one of the first meetings I had was I just brought the studio to Cigna, to one of the Cigna offices. And this was a health promotions team. So they worked with members, Cigna members on their like wellness programming. And so she brought her team down to visit the studio and we talked about what the offerings were. And they were the ones who provided the client referrals.
Okay.
So, and Mobile Mini, and that was like in July. So the studio really hit the ground, like opened in January of 2018. And, we were doing events like Phoenix Startup Week. I was kind of going around. ASU actually did a little event with Grant. I was doing little things here and there, but the first kind of corporate contract was Mobile Mini, and that introduction came through.
Awesome. And so your business grew from just you. So were you the one given the mindfulness meditation practices, or did you hire people right away?
I hired people right away.
Okay.
Because one
We're
of the
not
things,
playing. You're like, we're doing this.
well, first of all, I was able to hire people on a contract basis. So but one of the things that I decided early on is that this kind of education and training is, it's getting to be a little bit more regulated. As you mentioned that you've done yoga training, and that now has, pretty specific, like 200 hours, 300 hours. Like there's some agreed upon metrics for evaluating how, the training of a yoga teacher. And then beyond that, a lot of it is sort of, more intangible skill or talent, but mindfulness is getting to more of that accreditation or certification, but really was largely unregulated and uncertified in a lot of ways. And so one of the things that was important to me, because I think that mental health is, it's so important that when you're meeting people in this kind of space and in this kind of setting, that it can escalate easily, and you need to have people who are qualified to manage that. So I identified people who had significant mindfulness training from a couple specific programs, like University of Massachusetts is one I mentioned already, but there's another University of San Diego, and there's a couple programs that were a little bit more UCLA well-known, I guess. And all the teachers I identified had either at least a master's, either in social work or contemplative education, something. But I felt like if we're going to be trusted with this kind of holding space for people in this way, I think it's really important. And I didn't have that training. I was a practitioner, but not a trained facilitator. So I wanted to do that. And I think that, and it was a priority for me to pay those people well, because I also think that yoga teachers, when my understanding is that if you are able to generate your own following and, you can get paid well, but most yoga teachers aren't paid particularly well.
Right.
or I guess it depends how you define well, but I should say, the payments are pretty low for the amount of time invested in a class.
Yes.
And I thought, this is really important work, and I want to find people who are highly qualified and pay them what they deserve. So, and I think as it turned out, that it was really more just like my intention, but I think that was an important part also of getting confidence, or sort of like gaining confidence from clients. Because one of the things I would say is, here are the teachers, here's their training, here's their education. So we weren't just sort of like coming in and, especially because meditation, it's still less so today, but 5 years ago was still kind of in the category of like a little bit frou-frou, hippie, not necessarily totally accepted as an evidence-based approach.
Do you think that the pandemic, post-pandemic, that changed? Because now I think like post-pandemic, more people ask for it more at the workplace, right? And I think companies are now realizing the importance, right? Because work and life in general are interconnected. Like there's no separating them. And
Mm-hmm.
think now, like corporations, and they're starting to realize that.
100%. But I will say, one of the things that really heartened me when I started going out and pitching this idea was how many businesses, even in 2018, were already totally on board conceptually with exactly what you just said. Really understanding that there was, that the well-being of somebody at work and at home was inextricably intertwined. And that you really needed to attend to the whole person, and that mental health was an issue, and it was still very stigmatized. And so what they really looked at M2 in particular, and this was the intention, by creating, I like to call it like, here's a shiny silver toy. You do not need this space to meditate. You can do it anywhere, anytime, by yourself, whatever. But what you're trying to do is make it engaging, appealing, talked about, right? Because, people weren't talking about it that much. It was still more stigmatized, and people were very hesitant at work. Many employers offered significant benefits through their, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting not their EPA, their employee benefits, but people had often access to like clinical resources for mental health that were not getting utilized at all. And so employers, in fact, were really looking at M2, and we were looking at it that way too, as a way of beginning to normalize this conversation. And so to answer your question, which is, do I see a difference now post-COVID? And the answer is a resounding yes. I see a huge difference in the cultural conversation around stress and anxiety and mental health, and and all of it. So I think that there's certainly some residual resistance, and particularly in certain groups, but overall, I think people are much more comfortable. Like COVID, broke that egg wide open.
Yes, it did. The pandemic was awful. I lost a lot of people that I knew, unfortunately. But part of that time, I found so much good in it as well, like stillness and finding like these types of resources. But I was wondering, so those that are listening and they really want their employer to reach out to you and bring these type of mindfulness practices to their job, do you have like different pillars? What does that look like if a company reaches out to you and wants your services?
Yeah. So, and speaking of like gratitude to COVID, before COVID, 95% of what we did was offer guided meditation in the mobile studio. And now we offer a much more comprehensive set of services, both on and offline, because one of the, guided meditation by definition is most often an inward directed practice, where you're really trying to become more aware of what you're thinking, feeling, or sensing. During the pandemic, what we found was that people needed not only to develop better self-awareness and self-regulation, but also to connect with others, understand that other people, or many other people around them, were feeling all sorts of feelings, whether it was isolation, delight, all sorts of things, right? But there was a common humanity that was readily available, to connect with and stuff. And so we really did modify or add to our programming. So now we do, we call them like workshops or webinars. And the distinction, there's not a huge distinction really, but our workshops and webinars have several components to them. So all of them have typically 2 guided meditations during the session, and the sessions tend to be either 30 or 60 minutes. But there's also kind of a didactic piece where we're really talking about different topics related to mental health. So mindful self-compassion, mindful eating, thoughts on thoughts, flaws in forgiveness, just resilience, stress. So we have lots of different topics as it relates to mental health and well-being and emotional regulation. And so there's the learning portion, then we always have a science portion, trying to help people understand, like, we're not just talking about this because we think it's a great idea. There is this is scientifically backed, that this is what's going on in your brain. And these are some of the tools. So, we're talking about science, we're talking about a topic, we're doing some meditating, we might be using some other techniques. So, like journaling or visualizing, or making other techniques available. And there's an opportunity for discussion. So really helping people with questions, by like it's eliciting comments and interaction to help people connect with others, both either directly through the class or just knowing that, oh yeah, this other person feels this too. So we have over 20 different workshop titles. We also have series. So like a mindful self-compassion series, which is a 6-part series all on mindful self-compassion. And then we still do meditations too. So, and all of these things can be done either virtually in the studio, or actually we also send facilitators on site. So some organizations have a room that they can utilize and bring people in, and it just sort of seats more people or whatever. And so we do that there too.
Awesome. So is there anything else that you would like to add or discuss that we haven't touched on today?
I feel like I could you have to sort of rein me in. That's my challenge. I don't know what your questions were. I feel like I went, I just sort of like started talking away. So
we dove straight in. I guess those that are listening and are not familiar with what is mindfulness, give us a few bullet points of what mindfulness is.
Yes, I will. So the definition that I use for mindfulness is awareness of what you are thinking, feeling, or sensing, and allowing whatever you find to be there. There is, and even that is my sort of stock phrasing, but I feel like, again, that's kind of hard to understand. So this idea is that we walk around all the time with a million thoughts swirling in our heads, and sensations in our bodies and feelings in our hearts. And for the most part, we're just plowing through our day, or, getting things done. And mindfulness is really the opportunity just to pause and tune in to like, what is here right now? And what can I do with it? And what should I do with that? So what is here right now might be, oh, there's just a lot here right now. What should I do with that? Well, just take like 3 minutes and take a few breaths and rest and like bring down my heart rate and down regulate a little bit. Oh, what's here now? I'm fearful or I'm angry. Well, when my son walks into the room and asks me a question about something, I'm going to be more thoughtful about how I answer that question, because I'm going to recognize that I'm coming from a place of fear or anger, and that is going to make me tend to answer in a less skillful way, whatever is coming in to do. And so this way of like bringing it into your life, to me, it's actually just lots of repetitive, tiny check-ins. And then occasionally you can divide it how you want, longer episodes of like working at it. And a longer episode of working on it might be a 15-minute meditation. It might be a 3-hour hangout with some friends doing a vision board. It might be art, or it might be journaling. So it can look a lot of different ways. But this idea is just that you got to know where you are and also be okay with the fact that a lot of times where you are isn't in a positive place. And that's just part of being human.
Yes.
That's just part of being human. There's nothing wrong with that.
I'm so glad you said the end of that one, because I think even with me that, because I'm a yoga teacher and I do meditation practices, that I am not allowed to be upset. That I'm not allowed to. And I'm like, I am a human being and I am all of that.
That's the richness of life.
Yes.
Is having all of that.
Yeah.
And then it's just about sort of figuring out, okay, what am I resisting and what am I holding on to? Because either one of those things can make our journey harder, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of times we want to hold on to the things that are pleasant and we want to resist the things that are unpleasant. But by allowing the unpleasant and letting go of the pleasant, right? This is just what moves us through our lives. So it's that really letting it all be there. And I do think I'm glad that you said that, because there's this perception that even that meditation is about, like, I feel good, I've got no thoughts in my head. And that is not true. Yeah. We all have lots and lots of thoughts in our head. The difference is that most of the time we're not paying attention to what those thoughts are. We're letting our thoughts just sort of like run the ship without trying to understand what those commands are. And perhaps if they're like valid, right? So mindfulness is just tuning into like what that inner voice is saying and thinking, oh, is that authentic? Is that skillful? What am I going to do with that? So yeah, there's lots of emotion and yeah, there's all of it.
I'm curious to know two things. What are you reading? Like, what are your favorite mindfulness books? And who are your mentors? Like, who do you listen to give you that extra nudge to take it to the next level?
Oh, okay, lots of them. I've got lots of them. So I would say mentors are both friends and teachers. So I mentioned that I had 2 teachers that are mindfulness teacher, and actually the lead teacher for M2 is a woman named Debbie Halexa. And she's amazing. So she is a mentor for me. She works with me. She's a mentor for me, as is my original teacher. My friend who I took MBSR with, 2 friends that just listen to me all, part of this. And this is the community piece of it, is I have these 2 friends who are very interested in mindfulness too, but they don't have to be for this. But I just don't feel afraid to admit any feeling, no matter how ugly, to them. So these are the people, when you ask me like who inspires me, some of it is just like my friends who allow me to be whoever I am, who help me reframe and gain perspective. I would also say like following, this varies a lot. I love podcasts. So I love to listen. I listen to 10% Happier a lot. That's Dan Harris's. It's also an app, a meditation app, but I really enjoyed his podcast. Andrew Huberman is a neuroscientist at Stanford. He runs the Huberman Lab. He geeks out on all sorts of stuff. And then business-wise, I listen a lot to How I Built This, Guy Raz. I don't know if you know that one.
No, I don't.
So that was not mindfulness related. That's just,
love it.
Business related. Yeah, so I do listen to a lot of podcasts, and I'm trying to think of a book. Like right now I'm reading, like, what is it called? I almost want to look it up. The Undoing Project. And that's about a relationship between Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, I think. But anyways, those are 2 psychologists who they both like won the Nobel Prize. So I really enjoy like the scientific part of like mental health and well-being. So I follow a lot of that.
I love that. I love it because that side of it is always evolving. So there's always something.
Yes. And to me, that's a lot of keeping inspired, right? Because even though I know Like I've given up yoga in particular or meditation, for like long stretches of time, 3 weeks, lapse. I mean, believe me, there's, I may do this and advocate for it. That does not mean, just like we're talking about the ugly feelings. Yeah, I mean, I sort of get out of the habit or lose my mojo or whatever. But listening to these things reminds me beyond the leap of faith or the observations about what I'm doing, like, oh God, yeah, this is like so important.
Fun fact about you, mindfulness aside.
Fun fact about me. I don't know if it's like a fun fact about me.
Well, you speak Spanish.
I was going to say I was raised in a Spanish speaking home. My parents, I'm a first generation American. My parents are from, actually my family history is pretty convoluted, but my mother's technically Hungarian and she was a war refugee. She was raised in Santiago, Chile. And my dad is from Santiago too. And they met and married there.
Oh,
my mom was 18 years old. They're about to have their 60th wedding anniversary.
wow.
So yeah, so I was born shortly after they came to the US.
That's amazing. Did you guys move to Pennsylvania? Like, is that where you?
I went to college and grad school, and then I also worked in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia. So I, by myself, lived in Philadelphia. As a kid, we lived in Cincinnati, Ohio. I was born in Cincinnati. And yeah, I know, actually, this is like, I don't even know if this is a fun fact, but it's kind of fascinating to me. When I was growing up, I was in a small town. There were 4 like other kids. There was a Sri Lankan family, a Taiwanese family, my family, and I'm forgetting the 4th ethnicity, but it was so exotic to speak Spanish. Like my parents would literally talk about people behind their back, like, sort of talk smack about people right in front of them in Spanish because it was so exotic. Like nobody would ever understand you. And of course that would never happen now. Like you would never open your mouth to say, ridiculous things about people in Spanish and think that somebody wasn't going to understand.
Well, actually, that happened to me. I was at Walmart and I think it was either Halloween or back to school. If everything was chaotic and I had my little cart and these 2 ladies were talking about me in Spanish, like, and they were like, why is she bringing that cart to this house? Doesn't she see, nothing bad. And then so I started talking to them in Spanish and they were so embarrassed. It has been a pleasure having you here. I knew I was going to have a great time getting to know you and getting to know your story.
It was so nice to meet you. I really appreciate it and I'm honored by the invitation.
Thank you for listening. Please visit the website at www.leveluptribes.com. And please subscribe to the podcast and share with your family and friends. Be sure to tune in to our next episode. Catch you all next time, my beloved tribes.